It is my pleasure to introduce Matt Crebbin.
Crebbin.
Am I saying that right?
You are saying it right.
Okay. Matt is the senior pastor at the Newtown Congregational Church here in Connecticut. And he works, many of you may remember in the news a couple of years ago with the school shooting. So one of the things Mac does, he helps to build coalitions between churches, am I getting this right, and also works against gun violence. And maybe you can say more than that's
Sure.
basically what I got, but that's...
Sure. Well, let me come, just say I come to you not as someone who decided to study trauma as a hobby. I come as someone who was called to pastor in the midst of a traumatized community. And so I had a steep learning curve. But even with that steep learning curve, I still have a steep learning curve. So I hopefully also will acknowledge to you that I do not come here claiming to have all the information, all the knowledge needed. And in fact, one of the things you discover when you engage in work in trauma is that as a humanity and as a collective humanity, we actually still do not know all that we probably need to know to assist individuals and communities who have been affected by trauma. So one of the challenges is there's not necessarily this kind of perfect protocol that we can say, oh, this is everything you do and it works out great. There aren't necessarily you don't really have a broad base 100% or even very high percentage of folks who've experienced trauma where you can kind of say, oh, we know if we do these things after 5 years or 10 years that they'll come out okay, or they'll feel like, and that's one of the challenges. It's one of the challenges is there are things that are very helpful to some people, and those very same things do very little for other people. So part of this is to acknowledge that and to, at some levels, hopefully, as the church, to acknowledge how we can minister in the midst for individuals who may come to us, who may be sitting in our pews already, who've experienced trauma, in the midst of those of you who are clergy or just churches where your own community may experience trauma. And what are some things that might be helpful to know, things that I wish maybe I had learned before I had been thrust into this circumstance, and hopefully have some conversation and back and forth. I'm going to pass out 2 sheets for you. I'm going to pass one this way and one that way. And I believe...
the one page?
Yeah, one.
Okay.
It should have front and back.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other should be just a front sheet. And I believe these should be, at some point, if they're not already, up on the in the Dropbox of the conference. So if you want to have access to them in that way, you can do that as well. But what I'd like to do first is offer a prayer as we come together. This is actually adapted by a prayer by Chaplain Richard Lutz, who's a VA chaplain in Virginia, and or served several years ago. Let's just gather with prayer. Holy and gracious one, many of us have tears deep inside of our lives because we have been hurt in ways that go to the very core of our being. And some of the hurts we carry around have been there for a long, long time, even for years. We experience a loss from which even today we have not really recovered. We took a beating that ripped into our heart and soul and tore us apart at the deepest place in our life. We went through a betrayal of trust, the betrayal of a friendship, and still today we find ourselves dealing with the after effects and its residue. We suffered the unforgivable at the hands of a loved one, the hands of a parent, the hands of a neighbor, or we inflicted the unforgivable ourselves. There are scars that break open over and over again. Sometimes our tears come up and get very close to the surface. We can feel them just behind our eyes or even in our eyes. Sometimes they form a big lump in our throat, and then we realize again that they haven't gone away at all, and that they're still there, that they've just been buried for a while and now are back to make themselves known again. Holy and gracious one, you are the one who looks way down deep inside of all of us. You see and know what no one knows, no one at all except ourselves. And not only do you see us and know us, but you also feel things along with us, even the very painful stuff, the deep stuff, along with us. And we feel a strange kind of healing taking place. For it's like you care and you understand, and we're no longer left alone with our burdens. Today, those of us who are struggling inside, who've been broken or hurt or still feel the tears within, we offer our thanks for you being there and sharing with us what we cannot bear alone. Amen. So what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about trauma and its impact upon a community, and do a little bit of reflecting upon trauma as it impacts individuals, and then hopefully have some time of conversation where we can have some back and forth. And in order to do that, I'll try and be as efficient with my time so that there's extra time for us to talk. The two sheets you have, the first is a sheet that this orangish yellow sheet, which I found very helpful. It's a sheet that helps to kind of visually acknowledge on some levels a journey that a community undertakes. It's always a challenge because my experience of this journey and my experience of journeys in general is that most journeys are not linear. Mm-hmm. Yeah? So we tend to think in linear ways, and that's helpful to us as long as we don't get trapped saying everything has to be linear or it's somehow wrong or there's something else going on here. And I think the human condition is that, we don't always travel kind of linear journeys. But be that as it may, I still think this helps us. So first, the idea of a disaster is that there can be disasters of all kinds for communities in particular. We have what the insurance industry titles, for those of us of faith, acts of God. What we know of some of those disasters, and we know of some of our impact, is probably these are not necessarily just acts of God. There's a profound mixture of what we as human beings do to affect all kinds of things, and where we choose to live, and where we actually also choose to place people. Oftentimes, sometimes the most wealthiest people are in dangerous places, but very often throughout the world, it's the most poverty-stricken and the poorest people who are in places that portend the greatest disaster. What's that?
The Ninth Ward would be.
Yes, a perfect example. So we have to kind of look at this on all these kind of mixtures. But what we would normally describe as these hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, other kinds of things that we would say these are natural disasters. These are things that are affected by weather. Sometimes they're things that we know, on some levels at least, are coming. at least we might say, hey, there looks like a big storm coming. We aren't quite sure where, but so sometimes there is some preparation. You see that on this list a little bit of says kind of pre-disaster, some things that maybe we're conscious of. Then there are, of course, what we would call human-made disasters, and those are these disasters such as mass shootings, such as bombing, such as war zones, such as any number of things that you might imagine that we human beings seem to manage to do to each other that cause trauma of all kinds. On your sheet here with this descriptor, you'll see the left-hand side, this pre-disaster where there's threat or warning. Then you'll see there's this idea that there's an emergency, there's this thing that takes place. The interesting thing that does seem to happen is very often in many of these circumstances, there's this traumatic event, there's a disaster, then there is what they retire almost the heroic effort, the recovery, the honeymoon, the community cohesion. This is where communities respond, where if you've had a flood or something else, you see people, oftentimes just individuals, helping neighbors, with their own boat, bringing water, people responding in all kinds of ways, pulling together, even in the midst of really challenging circumstances, finding their way. Not always. There can also be instances where there's chaos and human beings responding in fear, but very often, at least on some levels, we see this heroic effort. We see communities coming together. One of the things that then happens is that doesn't last. And there is a time where then there is, as they listed, a disillusionment, where the community struggles with its identity, and where some people say, wasn't it so great when we were all pulled together and we were working together and it still felt like people were listening to me and understanding me, and even though we kind of felt that and we want to hang on to that, and yet we're not, and we become disillusioned, like, those people that they seem like so on the same page, and now we're like not on the same page. And you'll see there's secondary injuries, there's a struggle to adapt, to reintegrate. And what's helpful to me in my faith is thinking of the 23rd Psalm. And one of the things I look at is the emergency there when the actual event happens. That is the valley of death. Of death, whatever the event is. And it may not be necessarily just death itself, but a dying of what my life was, right? And what I would describe this is, and I think this is has been really helpful to me, at least to articulate this, is the psalmist doesn't talk about the valley of death, talks about the valley of the shadow of death. The valley of death is here, that's the experience. In some ways, the harder valley is the shadow of death that happens after, where people journey in that shadow of what happened.
You didn't trademark that, did you? We're going to steal
Oh, yeah, and I didn't trademark it. You
That was
can all
great.
take it.
I think didn't David do that a couple thousand years ago?
David probably did. And so, but I think it's helpful because sometimes that valley of the shadow of death, as you see here, is longer and much more of a struggle than even the initial, as traumatic as the first experience, the real experience is. The trauma and the struggle is much longer, and in some ways, as I describe, even for many people describe this being in Newtown, people thought, if we just get through the first year, we'll be okay. And then I have a lot of families that came to me and said, the second year is harder than the first year. And part of that is because we imagine, I think, that it's going to get better. If I just hold on, if I just make it, if I just move a little bit more, and just make it to that year, or if I just make it out of this initial few months, it's going to get better. But of course, the dissidence is just that greater because people experience it, in part because we experience, and we know this, those of us who are involved in just even standard grief work, we know that very often people that lose a loved one, even under the best circumstances, oftentimes, that grief initially is hard, but for many of them, the hard part is when they're supposedly going back to life, the normal life, and they experience it and say, there's a dissonance because life as I know it no longer exists because of the loss. And it becomes more clear when the world around you is on some level saying, go back, things are as they were. And people experience and say that it is not as it is. And we know this for people who've experienced trauma. We know this for veterans who come back who experience post-traumatic stress, that there is this dissonance because you go back to your life and your life is supposed to be the same, but because of these profound experiences, these traumatized experiences, you don't experience your life as the same. And that makes you feel even less safe and secure. Okay. And then as you see here, there is this idea that you go through these ups and downs, and ultimately what people would talk about is reorganization or reintegration or the coming of wisdom. That if you come to the ultimate, on this journey, as I said, that's the challenge, is linear journey. It doesn't really always feel that way. It's not always linear. But what we would call, at least my experience, is where the event is still there. It's a reality. It's not something that, or your experience of it, we know this for post-traumatic stress, for most traumatized people, it's not a forgetting. In fact, one of the challenges for post-traumatic stress is that people, try to forget or try to say, I'm leaving that, but it's an integration of what was experienced into what I am. And I'm in such a way that I'm no longer defined solely by that experience. I don't need that experience both to kind of identify myself, and I'm not worried that people might identify me through it. The best way I can describe it is like in Newtown, there's a point where there was, there's this ongoing thing where people still say, when you go somewhere else, where are you from? Don't want to tell people where I'm from because then they're going to see, I'm going to see the eyes and people are going to feel pity and everything else. And so there's that fear of I don't want to be identified by that. Or there are some people that may say, hey, I'm from Newtown. I want to share that because somehow it defines me in a way that's different. And I look forward to that. In some reality, kind of the wisdom of this integration, at least on some levels, comes when it doesn't matter.
Right.
I'm from Newtown. It doesn't matter for me to feel whatever you experience, whether you see me good or ill, pity or whatever, it's a part of just who I am. It's part of my life. Same thing for we might say for people that have experienced a trauma, that it is a reality of who they are, but it's not the sole thing that defines them or a thing that is their. So if you think about traumatized people who have experienced violence in their lives, most of the time that's what it's not the thing. One of the challenges very often you might hear, I don't talk about that, or the family, we don't talk about that. Okay, there's a thing that is still playing, and then there's also that thing where maybe I'm talking about, and it's so defining of me that it's not integrated into kind of the wholeness of who I am, and that is the big challenge. And there's not necessarily easy ways, and the struggle for the church is, how do we sit in that and help to sit with people and help to journey with people in the midst of their own experiences? Okay. Couple things for those of you that are involved as pastors or as faith leaders. When a disaster strikes, things we can do is check on anyone and everyone, particularly obviously those associated with your own faith community, but anybody that presents themselves. But very often, sometimes it's those people that you don't think about, people that are not the squeaky wheels. It's great to check on everybody. When you're...
I have another one of the white sheets.
Oh,
Here they are.
yep, sorry. Let me pass some more around. I think some other folks came in. So. There's a few more of this too.
Yep.
Be a presence. Very often in the early days, when somebody has experienced a trauma, what they need more than anything else is to know you're present to them. It's why I say, and you also want to meet immediate, particularly physical needs. Very often a traumatized person, the biggest part of that trauma we don't think about, even if they don't have any physical injuries, the trauma is experienced such a way that the body needs support, physical needs, like drinking water, making sure people have some food. You know, it's kind of maybe the instinct that the church has had, you know, where people show up when people have experienced a loss with, like, you know, macaroni and cheese, you know, at the door. It's like, eat, you know, we're here to make sure you eat, you know. It's probably, I mean, instinctually, it's probably old connections to this idea that, yes, we know you need to eat, we know you need food, we just want to make sure people, as much as possible, you're addressing their physical needs. As I like to say to people, that it's important to have your theology straight. If you're a pastor, what you believe, how you believe, God is in the midst of things. Have that straight, be secure in it, and then pretty much shut up. People don't really need you to be articulate, to be making meaning in those early days. Your job isn't, as I say here, it's less meaning making, it's more presence making. For me, that is theology. It's the understanding that God is with us, Emmanuel, this notion of presence. But you don't have to articulate, you know, you live it by your presence, as opposed to by saying, well, let me, even as people like struggle sometimes to say, well, how could this happen, you know? And suddenly, especially if you've been in seminary and you've got all kinds of great things that you've been studying, you are ready to say, well, let me tell you what I think about how this all fits together. And because they seem to really long for it, but basically, if any of you who've been with traumatized people, or people just in more general grief, I can't tell you how many times, even before all this happened, when I talk to people, they'll say, oh, I just remember you were there. I don't remember anything you said. I just remember. So even those great words that you think are somehow just the perfect crystallized words that people, they don't remember that. They remember that you were present with them. Okay. And if you're comfortable in what you believe, you know, you communicate that by your presence, as opposed to most of the time people that speak and try to offer these little bits of theological gems about where is God in the midst of this, or how is God present, or how is God with this. You know, it's because we're not comfortable really believing what we're saying. And I would also say the other thing about that is, even if you think of what your best theological sense is, and find the best sentence you can use to articulate that, say it 1,000 times over to yourself, and see if it still has weight. Because it does. Oftentimes, even the best stuff you have is not enough. And so sometimes you need to acknowledge that in the moment and just be present. Okay. The importance when you minister in a trauma situation, obviously a communal situation, as we experience, are the connections you have. The challenge is, if you have only connections in your local community, and that's the community that's been affected by a disaster, all those connections are overwhelmed too. Okay? So while that you can have some support, and there is support, there was clergy that was with me, and in some ways you can't, I would have made it without my fellow faith leaders who were with me and who experienced things I experienced. On other levels, there was no way they could be supportive of me. Okay, and so as I mentioned here, all your other connections too, like anybody that you work with and partner with, therapists, anyone else, more than likely they're going to be overwhelmed. So know what your other connections are, regional national support. We have a great disaster ministry. We partner with the Presbyterians. Within 24 hours, a team from the Presbyterian Church Disaster Ministry was on the ground, people who had experience with shootings, who had been in other places and could offer a different perspective and support. And that came through as a call to me from my wider region, folks that I trusted who said, we have this, do you want, you have to decide if you want it. They'll come and they'll support you. And I said yes, and it was probably one of the most helpful things early on, to have people from the outside, from beyond that circle. The other thing about connections is those connections you have within the community, the connections of the church, are only good after in the midst of a traumatic event, a disaster, as they were before the disaster. So if there's dysfunction, it's only exacerbated in the midst of things. There may be a honeymoon where some of that disappears a little bit, but then the dysfunction just goes, right? So you have to be aware of that, and it's also why the work you do daily, the work that we do as churches, as faith communities within the community, by building bridges and making connections and promoting understanding and building trust, even with people that maybe worship different than we do, or function different than we do, or are not, religious entities, but others. All of that kind of stuff is so important. It becomes so clear when you're experiencing trauma. The spiritual and faith resources for individual communities involved in trauma. More, especially as I've gone through this with different people, healing for many people is a lousy way to visualize or to talk about what they're going through. It's a hard way to imagine their journey. Healing doesn't, it feels like, healing implies I'm going to be back to where I was at some point. I broke my leg, it gets set, and sometime, in a few months, I'm going to be walking and doing all the things I would do. For most folks who have experienced trauma, it's like, that becomes a hindrance because it feels like I'm not going to heal. The interesting thing for trauma, and I'll say more about this, or people that have been traumatized, is, as I said, presence is important. Gathering, singing, sharing with others who have already been on that journey, people who've had shared experiences, storytelling, meaning making by, as people progress, people are able to tell their stories in a safe place and with people that can receive it. We know, for instance, with veterans, one of the challenges for post-traumatic stress for many of our veterans who return into their communities is they instinctively know they cannot tell their family their story because they will traumatize their family members from their experiences. But they don't necessarily have another place to share their stories.
Don't tell it anywhere.
And to integrate it. They don't tell it anywhere, exactly, because they know it's horrific.
It's helpful to have some other people who've experienced the same or similar situations, because then they understand what they feel, what you're going through.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Right. That's why this comment. And one of the things that happened to us in Newtown is we had the Amish from Nickel Mines come, families who had lost children in a shooting in their school, and in a very quiet way, because the Amish didn't want any publicity, but who had offered. They had the ones that said, "Hey, we'd like to come." We're able to meet with parents who had lost, and here are people, very different cultural experiences, and yet very potent and powerful in the ability for people to talk and share in ways that others just cannot grasp. Yeah, and so it's why you have, so often for veterans. We had this with our first responders. Many of them, they didn't want to talk to anybody else. It's only been since we've had now some of the first responders connected to 9/11 in New York City, who actually created their own with support and others, created a means to provide support to first responders who experience trauma and disasters, that we're able to kind of get into and have some conversations with in different ways. Because others, it's like, no, it doesn't matter. You weren't there. You don't know what my trauma is, and I can't share it with others. So, very important. Empowerment. Is also how do we feel empowered if I've been traumatized, if I'm a traumatized person, how am I experiencing empowerment in my ability to make decisions in my life, to be able to feel like I have some control over any number of things. Very important. I mean, sometimes with a traumatized person, people want so much to kind of support so much by protecting, by not involving people in decision making and in different parts of the process, and yet that disempowers people. Our instinct to kind of say, I'll take care of you, disempowers people to be able to make, to be involved in that process, in that journey. Even early on, where there's an instinct, well, the parents, they just can't take some of these decisions that they have to make about what they're going to do with their child. But really, I think most of us know, ultimately, I think, that as much as possible, people that are engaged in, even if it's really hard decisions, even if it's really tough stuff, it's much more helpful for them to feel that they're empowered and part of that decision making, and also then not having to, in the end, wonder, what if I had done something different and had made a choice. At least they could make a choice and be able to say, yes, I decided at that moment it's the best choice I could have made, as opposed to being angry with somebody else. Why did you keep that from me? Why did you not let me make this? Okay. A quote here from Anne Lamott, which is, I think, helpful. I used the broken leg image. She uses it a little differently. I think it's a really great way. She says, when you lose someone you can't live without and your heart is badly broken, the bad news is that you never completely get over the loss of your beloved. But this is also the good news. They live forever in your broken heart that doesn't seal back up. And you come through. It's like having a broken leg that never heals perfectly. It still hurts when the weather gets cold, but you learn to dance with a limp. There is a way in which you always have that wound with you, but how do you dance with the limp? For traumatized communities, there's no good models for this. When Newtown said, what do we do? People said, we don't know. If you look at all of the various communities that have been that had experienced disasters or trauma, all of the measurements for health aren't good. Divorce rates go up, issues of addiction and substance abuse go up, and issues of kind of all the kind of measurements and metrics that you would use for any community that has faced a disaster. You don't find any communities that have kind of found some kind of magic way that moves you through this. Well, I'll say a little more in a little bit, but that's one of those challenges, and we're starting to, for Newtown, part of this was then trying to find things that maybe by saying, okay, let's be proactive, let's try stuff. Sometimes I think communities say, wow, we've had so much hurt, we've had so much trauma, let's just try and make it, let's not get too, let's not have more failures, An interesting thing, this conversation we're having in the church these days, it's the same kind of thing, I think, is one of the things you got to do is you got to be willing just to try stuff. make broaden opportunities, things that people kind of go, wow, I don't know, is that going to really be what we need? Yeah, it seems like you need a lot of different opportunities for people, particularly, and this is where it gets into models for healing. You need we need to really recognize that trauma is as much an impact upon the body as it is upon the mind. And so very often our traditional modes of recovery, such as talk therapy, have not shown themselves to be very effective for many traumatized people. And in part that's because when you've been traumatized, when somebody is experiencing like post-traumatic stress, from what we can tell now and have more of a better sense of, is that they can't think their way out of what they're experiencing. Because what happens is the mind is responding out of the same thing the mind was when the event happened. And that mind is more like basically, one way to think about it is the reptilian mind versus kind of the frontal cortex mind. It's the instinctual response. And so all the kind of things when people, all the measurements, for instance, when you have somebody that's had post-traumatic stress and their anxiety and everything goes up and they're feeling this all this stuff, and you kind of say, it's all the kind of stuff that you would think, oh, we'll reassure you, we're going to talk through this, we're going to process it, it's like, seems to be very ineffectual. What's interesting is if you can alter the person's body, then you can be effective. And guess what? The church, we got this kind of stuff in our DNA. Guess what? We do it for 1,000 years. Oh, we pray. We meditate. We breathe. We sing. Singing. All those kind of things that take our mind out of kind of the processes of intellect into those other parts of the mind. Exactly. Very potent and powerful. And what we're finding is we have a center now that's in the community. It's our resiliency center, and it has a lot of stuff from massage to yoga to all these alternative tapping. Tapping, in fact, we found has been very helpful to a number of people that who now several years out, kind of have been in this kind of cycle that say nothing's working. I'm still not sleeping. I'm anxious all the time, and they've been going like multiple times all the week, going through traditional talk therapy, but they're not getting out of it. And yet tapping is the means of using
Kind of like acupuncture points.
yeah, it's a self-care. So you don't have to you learn how to do tapping and you need to use certain points in your body, pressure points.
There's a protocol
Right.
that you go through, and it
Yeah.
releases motion that's stored
Right,
in the body.
it releases it, but it's using again those body mechanics to alter kind of basically from what we can tell, even body chemistry, right? So when somebody's feeling anxious, by using it, and the other great thing about it is you don't necessarily, once you're trained, you have to go through protocols. People experience this, is that you practice it on yourself, right? So it's not like, oh my God, I'm experiencing this. I got to go get somebody to help me and fix me. It's also empowering, and it also ties into this self-empowerment. So a lot of other kinds of techniques like that, like meditation, like simple like breathing techniques, that help people again to alter what's going on, even if and then be able to do some processing as it needs. Yeah.
I'm just thinking of individuals who say, I can't handle this, I'm gonna go for a run. Or
Yeah.
go out and decide to chop wood. It's the same sort of a thing.
Yes. Yeah, it's very much very much a part of that physical. I mean, people instinctively oftentimes know that what's going on that isn't working, and they find other means.
It wasn't a therapy that did much for me personally, but cranial sacral therapy is like that touch your head and your body meridians and all that. And apparently it works wonders with lots of people, but didn't with
Right.
me. But I couldn't hold their touch to me, but
Yeah, we have people. We have aromatherapy
Yeah.
that's used. A lot of things, and one of the things, of course, that what we're discovering is, there's not like oh, tapping works for everybody.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
You know, so, it seems to have a pretty good, and what's nice is we're actually now starting to have more studies done in alternative methods, which is really what we need. You know, you need, especially in the midst of the trauma community, I'd like to know that there's stuff that people are doing that has some study behind it, not just subjective people saying, this helped me. That's nice, and it's not bad to try stuff, and that's part of what we said is, hey, we'll try a bunch of stuff, but it's nice to have more. And we're seeing, actually, interesting, the military is one of the places where they're doing more and more experimentation for veterans coming back in wider circles for post-traumatic stress of different kinds of programming, body-mind style, as opposed to traditional therapy where they're setting up line studies and have people that kind of do a traditional group back, and other groups where and part of what they've managed to recognize, even with that, for instance, and it's also where I think the church can be helpful with these kind of different things, is rather than say, self-identify as post-traumatic stress. And so you have veterans that, you know, well, I'm not going to self-identify as post-traumatic stress. People are going to look at me different. Is they basically take circles of people that are coming back and say, we're all going through this. It's part of the process of going back into. And they'll do other measurements to kind of measure where people's anxiety or other things are, but they don't say, we've identified you as
Right.
post-traumatic stress. And because if you give everybody tools, right, because then I'm more stressed, I'm also like, oh, then there's this, there's all this stuff.
Right.
And one of the things that happens is, so if you create communities and cultures of practice, even whether you're identified or not, you help a broader swath, because even if I don't have post-traumatic stress, actually a lot of things happen, still reduce general anxiety and other things, right? So it's one of the things I think the church as a community can do. The more we offer and the more we think about offering some places, one of the things that we are finding, and we found fairly, after about 6 months or so in Newtown, is if you said, this is something to do with helping people dealing with the after effects of Newtown, nobody showed up, right? When you had, there was somebody, one of our churches was having folks come and with people that were knowledgeable in grief counseling and the various stages of grief, and talk about this, and they invited the whole community, and like 6 people showed up. And it's always 6 people that don't show up to everything. You know what I mean? We always go to church. You have some. There's certain people that just show up. Yeah, which is great. I love those people in my church. They come to everything. And some people that come and they need help and they need support, and it's awesome that you have those. But one of the things is so that was it. And then when they had their therapy dogs that had been with them for a while, again, therapy dog, therapy animals, therapy dogs, very powerful. Again, it changes the biology of people. Your stress, anxiety. Suddenly, people are touching, a dog or a cat, that has, kind of gone through a process, so they're used to just hands all over them, very potent. And so they had their therapy dogs that had been there for a while, and they were like saying goodbye to their therapy animals. Or some of them may still actually now have one kind of realization out of this. But they said, well, come, we're going to have dinner and thank our therapy dogs and their handlers and who've been with us. And they had 100 plus people come, and then they ended up going through, and people were processing some of that stuff. As with the dogs, they were able also then to process other things, and you had a much bigger event, but it was an event that we're here to help. It's only this event for those people that have experienced things. So, one of the things that happens that the church can do, I think, on an ongoing basis is, are there places where people can just come in and experience things that if they've been traumatized or had trauma in their life, you don't have to self-identify them and say, this is for traumatized people. But here are things that are helpful kinds of things, like if you're interested in tapping, come in and say, here are ways to help reduce anxiety, to stress. We have God, what does everybody say? God, it's such a stressful world. I'm so crazy. And if you really have places where you can say, hey, here's a program for a certain period of time, we're going to honor that time frame. People, you're likely to get a broader swath of people, and people suddenly, and especially if you do it a few times, because sometimes people do it in one person, boy, I didn't know about going to that. I don't know, tapping. I mean, what is that going to do to me? And then somebody goes, but what happened in our town, somebody said, this will really help me. And somebody else goes, well, gosh, maybe I'll try it. I mean, nothing seemed to help me. And suddenly that creates this. And the church as a community, I think, is a wonderful place that we have traumatized people in our community. You don't have to have gone through what we went through to know that people can have experienced trauma if they've been, abused, right? Physically, sexually. We have folks in our congregation, many of whom don't identify. And we're kind of in a general silence around that. And I think it's important not to have silence around that. It's important for us to articulate as the church and as a faith community that this is a place that does not garner just silence, and that really affirms and supports and connects people. But also, people still not believe us. Okay. But we don't necessarily have to just help people by raising up issues sometimes and saying, hey, we're going to look at this. We can help people if we're mindful that people are experiencing trauma by providing programming that makes a difference in terms of how they're able to live their life. And then how some of them may be able then also to come forward and to help the whole community to address it in a more holistic fashion. Because so often we kind of are looking around, and the thing about this, as you know, with our widening the welcome, is that for a lot of people who have been traumatized in our communities, we may have some awareness on occasion that somebody has been, because maybe we know their story, because maybe they've shared it, or maybe we know the story of their family, or maybe they act differently in certain contexts that make us go, something going on here. But we may not be aware. We probably aren't aware of so many people. It's not this kind of disability where we would say, oh, there's something that I just know. I see it, or I recognize something else. It's silent. And so the way in which we can respond, I think, is to recognize by just doing programming that can help all people, but being sensitive to the reality that a number of these kind of programs and offerings can make a big difference, especially for people who've experienced trauma in their lives. Okay? You'll see the trauma and resilience. There's things that I've talked about in different ways. I don't want to go through all of those things. There's kind of a list of some bullet points with that about making connections. One of the things that we know from people who have been traumatized, interestingly, is people that seem to have stronger outcomes in terms of their lives are people that are connected. It's just the reality. People that are isolated generally struggle more. People that have connections, very often people in churches. Churches, for all the things that we can talk about how the church is like failing the world, it's interesting that church is a place where actually we see people living longer. And partly, from what we can determine, is it's not just the wine that people drink with their communion, that nice red wine that maybe is a little antioxidants, but it's that it's the connectional reality that is the church.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Following the trauma of your town,
Yeah.
did you find that those next few Sundays you had a bigger influx?
Yes.
Of people?
Yeah, people showed up. And then, I think that's generally when there's either a national crisis. Obviously, we saw those of us around this area after 9/11.
People flooded.
Definitely around here.
Yeah.
And we've seen more interesting. What we've seen is, I think, there was definitely we were full. I mean, we were full people were standing room only for a number of weeks. We've definitely seen a drop from that, but from numbers to that, I'd love to tell you it's all just me, like as a leader. We're just a growing church, and we were doing a lot of great things. But we have seen, and I would attribute, part of that is people wanting connection. People recognize, there's a moment when it comes, and not everybody, right? There's people that kind of come, they instinctively are here, but then there's also people, and part of it, I think, is that we tried to do all those. People want connection, and sometimes the church comes. When they come to church, it's like, well, this is the last place I'm going to find connection. So, what do we do with that? But part of that is is I think people experience that and continue to hunger for that and recognize that's an important part of their lives.
The the hungering for connection, is that why your long-term rebuild line is higher than your pre-disaster?
Yeah, I think this is them saying there's hope. This is not mine, just so you know.
Okay.
This actually comes from other, this is kind of common in terms of disaster. And some of them have it a little bit like almost there. I think, yeah, because what we would say, I think what we would say in general, and I think this is hope. I mean, as Christians, I have hope that even after brokenness, the wisdom, the life reality that we have is on some level. I don't know if I would like to always, like I said, linear is the same problem with kind of just vertical linear, but that there is some way in which there is more wisdom that we have, and that's what most of them talk about is kind of this integration that comes. That really is this is described as wisdom, because wisdom isn't so much as knowledge, right? Wisdom is really an integration with what is most important in life and with what you want to be about. And so ultimately someone who's been traumatized or a community that's had trauma, if you going through those shadow and all those things, the promise at the end there is not so much that you've forgotten about that experience, but because that experience is integrated, you have more wisdom. So, you know, one of the things I say, like as a descriptor of this, that I think is helpful. We're still on our journey. We're still in these like up and downs. We're coming up on our 3rd year anniversary. That's going to be a valley for us on this journey. Is, you know, when we've had different. I'm in southern Connecticut. I'm in the most Republican county in Connecticut. Still, I mean, Connecticut's still we all have mixtures of people if you're from Connecticut or anywhere, but you know we still have kind of New England, which is old republicanism, which is kind of like, you know, fiscally conservative, socially more on the liberal end of things, you know. But one of the things that, you know, so after these experiences, when the verdict for Trayvon Martin, you know, with George Zimmerman happened, I had people in my congregation who cried because I had grandmothers, you know, who were these good Republican grandmothers, you know, who were like, you know, kind of law and order grandmothers, but they're like, they didn't have to imagine what it was like to lose a kid and what they would want to see. So there's this kind of compassion quotient that I think happens when you've experienced trauma and brokenness, and that's what opened up in our community. You introduced me where it was conversations that we've had with urban communities. The only thing I would say to tie that in is we had a lot of support from others. Newtown is not lacking for resources in terms of intellectual capital, emotional capital, you know, all kinds of things, and just financial capital. One of the things is we've engaged in conversations like with urban communities has been you have communities that have been repeatedly traumatized, and there you have virtually a thing that's, you know, everybody says, wow, Newtown, you got a long journey ahead. You have folks that have been repeatedly traumatized in neighborhoods and in communities, and people's, you know, a week later, why aren't you, you know, working? Why aren't you back? Why isn't the community doing this? Why aren't you doing this? Blah, 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 blah. You know, there's an expectation like that has no impact, you know. I mean, talking with folks, you know, who, you know, children who have to walk out from their house almost over a dead body that's still in the street that the police are investigating, and not a recognition of what impact that trauma is having upon those children. We don't even, you know, nobody even bats an eye, or many of us, at least, outside of the community. And so there's not a recognition of the way in which that trauma continues to impact and affect people. If we're human beings and we experience trauma, we're all going to be impacted by it. It's just, you can't escape it. and yet we kind of expect that in certain places or for certain circumstances. Or at least we kind of ignore it. So with that, I'll just close and we can have some more conversation. The rules of thumb for traumatized people: least connected people seem to struggle most. Mind, body, we've talked about. As bad as early days are, often the worst times are ahead. I think the church is a place, we have this built into our DNA. It's a part of what the church has done for thousands of years. We've sometimes lost sight of that. Sometimes we've become enamored of just talking. I'm talking here. We get enamored just of kind of talking through problems. The church, though, if you think about it, for thousands of years, didn't just talk. You know, we have a rich, vibrant connection to how we have worshipped, how we have lived together. You know, sharing everything from sharing meals to prayer to a meditation life. You know, we've talked about things that we were much more connected in. You know, we've kind of adopted more and more of the rigors, I would say, after the Protestant Revolution, where, you know, it's like just the intellect that we nourish. And as much as we need intellects nourished, we have to nourish the other parts of our lives, especially for us as Protestants. The other thing is whatever dysfunction you have, like in a church, or healthy attributes within your community, they're exponential after a crisis, right? So one of the reasons we deal with dysfunction before, as much as possible in the current reality, is because if you think it's bad now, it's going to be worse after an event. The other thing is we don't want to re-traumatize people. There's this delicate balance, and certainly, you know, families in our community with the anniversary coming up, all these kind of things happening, you get really, there's this nervousness around re-traumatizing people, and you don't want to just kind of do things for the sake of traumatizing, but we don't do them any favors, and we try to protect them from grief and anguish. You always work to allow them to make decisions about what they wish to do, about who they are, how they decide on their journey, and about you know, there's an instinct sometimes to protect, and ultimately we don't end up protecting people well. And even with children, there is appropriate, obviously, ways in which that. But one of the things is, for us with this event, is if our kids, if it comes to big secret nobody talks about, then it's as bad as, or even worse than what we might imagine it. So how do you help children to process, to grieve, to go through that in a way, again, that they can integrate themselves and not kind of say, oh, that's the big secret that nobody talks about. It must even be worse. And so they can, and believe me, children can imagine even worse. Then the only thing I remind people about with traumatized folks, especially if you're ministering with them and trying to be a caregiver and a person, is get training in resiliency work, gain familiarity with various forms of care and treatment beforehand. It's not a time. It's really hard in the midst of everything. You know, I mentioned this in the paper in the beginning. The problem with a disaster like one that we had is that you have a disaster within the disaster. So the disaster happens, and then you have, for our church, we had thousands of phone calls, thousands of emails coming in every day. We couldn't respond to all of them.
I heard that the teddy bears were a disaster within a disaster.
Right, we had teddy bears, we had trucks filled with apple pies, we had, you know, anything you can imagine was showing up in town. Oh, and actually, it started the first couple of days, and fortunately we had resources of people that said, you know, as bad as this is right now, in a week it's going to be worse because people are loading up trucks in Iowa right now.
Yeah.
You know,
People
and
wanna connect.
right, they want to connect, and so that's going to show up. You know, so you think, oh, we'll make it through a couple of days and we'll be okay. No, it's actually going to get worse. So you got to prepare yourself for that kind of disaster within disaster. So the thing you want to be able to do in advance, if I had known more of this, was what are my, you know, who can I reach out to? What are those connections that I can rely on because, you know, I had 1,000 therapists who were ready to show up. Were they skilled in trauma? Did they work, specifically with, they could tell me this, but what do I, what's your reference? There's no way I'm going to be able to interview and process and screen people to deal with that. I need trusted folks that can say, we have these people that are trusted, that I can't do that kind of work. The other big thing is don't let yourself be sacrificed. There's always more you can do. Early on, I heard this from the folks that came in. They said, you know what? People think if I just make it through as a caretaker, if I just make it through the first month, things will slow down. If I just make it through the month later, it sounds slow. Okay, if I make it through the first 6 months, then it'll be okay. Then it's not gonna be okay. And so they say you got to take care of yourself. There's always more you can do. There's always more. And it's always good. Here's the thing. It's not bad stuff that you can do. It's good stuff. You want to talk about temptation? You want to talk about sacrificing yourself on the altar of the good? This is not sacrifice yourself on the altar of ugly, terrible stuff. This is good stuff that needs to be done. So you got to acknowledge your own need for self-care, and then find that care and support. Find a support within the circle. It was so important to have people that were within that circle that went through it, what I went through as faith leaders and others. There are connections that we made that will last a lifetime. But I also needed, they couldn't support me in certain ways that an outside circle could. So you need both of those circles. And the other thing is not only don't sacrifice yourself, but don't sacrifice those you love on the altar of ministry. That's a temptation for ministers in general, my experience is, but it's very much a temptation in the midst of a traumatized event, a disaster, is you take care of everybody else and your family. And I'm more attentive now to my family. I say, hey, I'm going to see my son run cross country. I work less hours, and people ask me, I say, I gotta. It's clear to me as well as probably to you that I gotta be connected to those people who I love the most, and be present to them, and let go of some stuff, and we'll have to figure out how best to still care for everybody, but I'm not going to be able to do the kind of ministry you want me to do if we don't do that. And people have been good about that. For me, at least, in my congregation, because they were through that too, nobody says, oh, you shouldn't spend more time with your kids. So that gives you a little bit of stuff. Now we have 20 minutes or so here. I know I talked for quite a while, mostly. Willing to have people raise up stuff. If there's other experiences you have, questions you have, whatever, I'm happy to.
There's one group that the talking about it is perceived as detrimental, and that's emergency first responders, like the police.
Yeah.
Because if they show their weakness to their department, they're perceived as being weak and incompetent. Or that may not even be true, but that's their perception.
Yeah.
So you can't say, I wept when I saw that child whose head was blown off. You
Yeah.
can't say that.
Yeah. Yeah, they're some of the hardest ones. I think even more so, definitely first responders in general. I think police even more so. Because of that, right? Because that's tough. I mean, I think
You're not gonna
even
get that
sometimes
promotion.
even your other emergency personnel like fire and others, sometimes it's a little easier for the process because they're because they're there oftentimes to, but you're supposed to be the one that's tough. And it really was for us. It really took having first responders from 9/11, from a program that was and guys that mostly men, but some women that were first responders in New York City and who developed this program, who said, I can come in, we're going to do this, and they had credibility.
Yeah.
Because if I tell them or anybody tells you, we're going to process through this. They're like, I'm not going to. But somebody else says, look, for my survival, we had a first responder from the Amish community who was not Amish but was there on scene, and he's traveled with them to several things, and he was very powerful too to be able to talk in this case with fire and other personnel to really just share, because again he had credibility, because I was the first on the scene at this place, and it just changes it. And he was also very good, 'cause he says, if I don't talk about this, if I wasn't sharing this, I would not be alive today. He could say that to them in a way that other people couldn't hear.
I work in Stanford Hospital as a chaplain.
Uh-huh.
And those of you who are from Connecticut may remember 2-3 years ago, there was a fire on Christmas Eve that wiped out a family. And we were surprised. The firemen actually came to the hospital, got the chaplain that was on duty that night, and said, come to the fire, so that we have on-site support.
Yeah.
And then he in turn called the rest of the department to come into the hospital to be there to support whoever came in. But a few days after the fire department called us and worked together with our department through the hospital to organize an event at the fire department where all of the emergency personnel who had been involved that night came in and talked, and had chaplains available to sit and talk to. And there were people who were coming in and they were traumatized because they had not been there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe if I'd been there,
Yep.
something. There was a doctor in the hospital that broke down in tears 3
Right.
weeks later because he hadn't been on duty.
Right.
And
Yep. And we had that. There was there's
And-
a process
Yeah.
of guilt, of survivor's guilt,
survivor's guilt.
and even a responder's guilt, if you will.
Yeah.
The
Right.
people that
But-
people who are angry with the person who was selected to go in to the school, because they should go, and yet also recognize that person experienced awfulness and didn't really necessarily want that awfulness themselves to be visual, and yet there's this dynamic of for all of them, I should be the first one. I signed up to be the one.
Right.
It's very tricky because a lot of first responders can't involve themselves emotionally in what they're doing.
No.
But I mean, essentially, for a doctor, my brother's an ER doc. He cannot involve himself emotionally.
Right.
I'm sure that it still accrues on him, and he has ways to let it out
Right.
and talk and process it. But
Right.
it's complicated. It's not like you can just, after my brother takes the bodies of 10 people away,
Yeah.
and says, okay, you're dead.
Yeah.
You can't talk to him right then. David, how's it going? How are you feeling about it?
Yeah.
He's still working, so it's very complicated.
Well, one of the interesting, you highlight this, one of the interesting things is these days, because we're aware of the trauma for significant events, you have protocols for police and fire who have responded. Those protocols happen, but most of those protocols in general happen early on. And they're important, but they kind of happen in this home, almost in the honeymoon stage, which is important, and there is cohesion, and people come and they talk about their experiences and everything else. Well, I think what we find, and I think one of the things to be aware of, is what happens further out when people have experienced it. Maybe there was some support, but that doesn't mean you've kind of, sometimes we think, oh, you got the support early. We almost think we still have a medical approach to this in terms of, okay, if we get the triage done quick here, we'll stem the tide of damage, and it's all done. And then what we discover is it helps, but that there is an ongoing need to how do you help for that ongoing recovery, if you will, from the experiences, the ongoing processing of the experience. Because they do, they almost demand you have to be present. But you have to be for police and fire when there's something like this. They have protocols. Like I knew, the guys had to show up at the fire station the next day.
For a debrief.
They had to go. Yeah, you had to debrief, and then you had to show up. They had another, certain times. And then you got to do this, and the same thing. The police, you have these things. And you're required. Of course, you're required to be. You aren't necessarily required to do certain things, and some
Right.
won't. So that's part of that. I think that's a challenge for us.
Just to affirm what you're saying, I have the privilege of being chaplain for the local fire department, in addition to serving a church in the area where we live. And I'm still, I mean, let's see, I'm 9 years in chaplaining, I think, but so they finally trust me.
Yeah.
A little.
Right, a little. And they'll come find me in my office at the church as opposed to at the station, kind of as looking for that backdoor conversation. I'm really,
Right.
hey, chaplain, we're just gonna go get a beer, which is really code for, I have something that I need you to help me carry, but I can't say it out loud.
Yeah.
And some of those men and women are still profoundly affected from the wrinkles of the shockwaves of 9/11,
Yep.
whether they were present or not, just
Yeah.
their field. We're up in Maine, and there was that kind of referred shudder from the Newtown experience.
Yeah.
But, that brotherhood, that sisterhood of wanting to be connected,
Yeah.
and feeling so incredibly inadequate and torn, not being able to do more. So even though some of the things that we see are not great community trauma events, when there's a bridge jumper with a completed suicide, or
Yeah.
the death of a child at a run, those things have that impact, and it
Yes.
kind of seeps through the whole.
Right, and that's part of it, is that sometimes we only think trauma is like
Those
these
big hurricane
big
events.
events,
Right.
I mean, those are disaster events, but trauma, yeah, people experience that, and people who are exposed to that, whether it be ER doctors or, there is this detachment. You have to do your job, but there's also the reality of how that impacts that ongoing trauma, and that's there. And I think that the challenge for us in the church is that, like, part of my point here is that it's a lot more prevalent there, and the good, I mean, that's bad news. I think the bad news is trauma. There's a lot of trauma that people are experiencing. I think the good news is we're aware of it, and we're sensitive to it as the faith community, and we even live kind of in our own midst, that we don't even necessarily have, not all that we have to do to respond to trauma is stuff that has to be, we're doing trauma work. It's
Don't
part of
call
what the
it that.
church does in its
Just
DNA,
doing what you do.
as I say, that it helps, but if we're more sensitive to it, then also we maybe expand some of that kind of ministry to really help people, as I said, because there are people walking around and you don't realize the impact that trauma has until,
Right.
for me, as I've been now here, where people that didn't even have anything to do, come and they'll talk about,
Yeah.
start sharing a little bit of their own
Right.
traumatic experience, and
Right.
you go, oh,
And
yeah,
it's
I do that.
healing
Yeah.
to kind of make those connections.
Yeah.
And no matter what your trauma is or how you identify, or just, trauma may be a scary word, but just your experience.
Yeah.
I was sharing with someone about being here as a person with a disability. I just have a right leg ambulation issue, but it was kind of cool to come into this space where not only there were people who were clergy and laity who get clergy, but also people with disabilities. So it was like, it was kind of that tribe feel,
Yeah, yeah.
like when our vets wear their World War II hats,
Yeah.
and they don't know each other, but they see each other at the grocery store, and
Yeah.
it's like this superhero sort of thing that happens between them. So
Yeah.
this is a really cool place to
Yeah.
kind of say, okay, this is working, and we're still working at it. So I
Right.
appreciate it.
Is the progression fairly similar for a nature-made crisis as well as a?
Yeah, this is actually developed more. We have more, interestingly, probably more study an understanding of natural disasters
Right.
than we do of human disaster, if you will. So there's really that like even comes out more of the natural disaster. There's different functional things. Like in Newtown, we didn't have, it wasn't like we had to rebuild buildings, and we had to tear down a school and rebuild a school, but we didn't have, like you might a hurricane or something where, part of that effort is how do you get, houses back, right? People, jobs that, industries are gone, and that trauma of that. But one of the things I think that you highlight that's a different challenge is with natural disasters is sometimes we think, and sometimes communities or individuals or even church will think if we, once we just get the church rebuilt, or once everybody got their house again, we'll be done. And there is a power, potency to feeling like, okay, that is back. But there's still people that are traumatized that are experiencing that. One of the things for clergy, for instance, that's mostly studied in disasters is most clergy that go through disasters, there's mostly studied natural disasters, mostly studies done more on the evangelical spectrum. That seems to be most studies that we have of clergy on the evangelical spectrum. But what you find is most clergy have left after 3 years after a disaster.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And you can't do all. There's not necessarily.
You mean
You
left
can do
the
coalition.
area or
Have
left
left, yeah. Left at least the area.
Oh, the area.
Yeah. Not necessarily left the pastorate, although
Are you telling
there's
us
some
something?
stuff that
I was
says.
gonna-
Yeah, no, it's like almost 3 years.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I say. People, information is powerful. It's good to hear that, actually, to know. That's also why self-care. I think one of the things that happens is, so people said early on, hey, listen, man, you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be here. I mean, that's really helpful to realize that, do I want to be here for people? Yes. So how do I do self-care? How do I, make sure? Because I think that's what happens. Is clergy, there is this high level and people are like, and sometimes, individuals have it, but clergy have this too, is like, you have a disaster, people go, I didn't sign on for this, I mean, I wanted to serve this church, nice church in Florida, we had this nice sun, and what do you mean we got like this hurricane now, and I got to rebuild a church, and everybody's relying on me to pastor in the midst of all this loss. I mean, because, I have a colleague, who was up, in Massachusetts, for the tornado that went through there, and I know that he has said, he struggled with, he's the pastor of the tornado, and you minister to people who've lost everything, and you're in that kind of stuff, and it's, wow, you can feel it takes its toll on you. So, so that's part of that. And so I think for the natural disaster, the big thing is sometimes we only think of the community kind of whole once everything's rebuilt. I mean, and you're seeing this in New Orleans, I would say, if we're looking at this, is there's this real kind of interesting dynamic going on because things are, some places are being rebuilt, some places are just kind of there, abandoned. And you have families with long histories that have kind of disappeared from those roots and the connections, and even if they're not there anymore, there are people that experience that now, and part of your identity is in that. I've gone back to the Biloxi coast, Back Bay Mission, UCC. I was there with a group just before the hurricane, in that spring before the hurricane, and we came back in that winter afterwards, and then I've been since 5 or 6 times. And even though one of the things that they said earlier was, don't forget us, because we know people are going to go on the next disaster, and even now, as years later, you still have some families that are not back in their homes. Parts of them that have been, they've been in there for generations, and they can't get back into their home. It's a piece of property that's the only thing they have in their whole lives. It's been passed down for generations, but they can't build. The house hasn't been rebuilt. So there's still that, even though people in general would say, oh well, everything's back, built back up.
I wonder if people recovering from disasters that are naturally caused have a harder time because it's really hard to define blame on anyone. Like could be an act of God. You can get angry at God.
Yeah.
but it's a little harder if you've got one individual person, or 9/11, you've got a bunch of people that it's pretty obvious who to blame, and people find that easier, but I think with natural disasters, they have a harder time addressing their anger somewhere, and so it kind of festers, I think. Maybe.
Yeah, well, I think it happens everywhere. I mean, well, the challenge for all of that is, what do you do with your powerlessness? That's really what we come to face with, whether it be a natural disaster or a human-made, is how do people deal how do we as human beings deal with our powerlessness? And with, whether first respond, like if I had been there, maybe one of those kids would have lived, or I could have stopped this. If it's man-made, that's what you have for there, and you have the whole struggle with the overlay here for the faith community is we have a whole struggle with forgiveness, right, and with reconciliation. Parents who you might imagine are angry with just the shooter in our case. And his family, but some who've kind of gone less from there to maybe being angry with themselves. Why did I put my child on the bus that morning? Right? They had a sniffles. Why did I? Or angry with other people. People that are there in our case are dead. And so that anger sometimes gets transferred to other people, people where, in fact, sometimes people being very, kind of forgiving in a sense like, well, it's a young man who's struggling, everything else, and they can understand themselves, but you can't forgive, your neighbor who's like, doesn't get it right, and suddenly your anger is generated to things, or your anger is, I'm going to have power over something, so then I will have control over something. Yeah.
You kind of touched on this, but I was hoping you would expand on this a little. How do you deal with some of those disasters that you were talking about, like teddy bears and that, all the good doers, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. How are you able to channel that into something constructive, but I don't know.
No, it's a great question. One of the things that is a gift. It's a gift to know people care for you. Mm-hmm. So as much as a community you had all these things, is the reminder, the mantra of people is people are doing this because they care. The other thing that's great about it is it gives as challenging as it is, it gives you things to do. Right? It's kind of like when you have a loss in the family. I always say part of the reason we have funerals and have all these rituals is it gives people things to do, right? And it's empowering, right? So we just talked about so people in the community that weren't affected at all, that were affected, but didn't have any children or anything, and they said, I feel powerless. Right? It's why people make. Like I said, make potluck. Here's food. I made food. I can't change the fact that your spouse died, but here's dinner. Because I can do something. And so we had a lot of people that had that. And so what was great for us was you leverage that with knowledge. And so one of the things that happened early on is before 24 hours was up was. There was someone from the White House on the ground who was from their faith-based initiatives office. And this was one of the people who said to us, along with the Presbyterian disaster team, they said, it's going to get worse. In terms of, you think you're getting you got a truck that showed up with apple pies, you're going to get 15 trucks showing up. And they're just going to pull up to the churches and say, hey, where do we deliver this stuff? What do you want us to do with this? And they said, so it's going to get worse. So the bad news is it's going to get worse. And the bad news is you are overwhelmed, the town's overwhelmed. The town, and by the time the town, because what happens in a disaster is the town has to ask for help from the regional disaster. The regional has to talk to the state. The state has to talk to the federal government. Nobody comes in, because the federal government doesn't want to come in anywhere and say, we're in charge. Because local people say, what the heck? There it is. See, the government, they're coming to take, they're taking over. It's black helmets are coming. And, it's,
Next thing it'll be
So
martial
there's a
law.
whole protocol. And they said, by the time you do that the chain, you'll be even more overwhelmed. But as churches, you guys can do whatever you want. You're not a government agency. So we actually know somebody who's worked with the Red Cross, worked with FEMA, has headed up at that time, you may recall, this was a little while after Haiti, the disaster, the earthquake in Haiti, who headed up all of the coordination for supplies coming into Haiti, who knows how to do this. And if you want to, we can call and see if you'll come. And you probably will come. And we said, yeah, have them come. And so we talked with them, and with the church this is great for faith communities. Like the Seventh-day Adventists, they are the warehouse wonders of the world. What we've divided in disaster ministries is very often is rather than all of our churches, all denominations trying to do everything, we've kind of divided it up some. Which I'm like, wow, it's kind of nice cooperation finally,
Yeah.
So often we're not cooperating. So the Adventists, they warehouse. They know how to warehouse. So when stuff arrives, they know how to process it, get it into a warehouse, do all that kind of stuff. And so they came through his connections. They come, a couple of the folks that are involved with that. And what they do is they say, we know all this stuff, but we can train your volunteers. We even have like the computer system, the program that you can download and then show you how to do it. You can, train volunteers in pretty rapid succession and get you up and running. You have to identify
Where?
what space and these are the parameters that we think you're going to need, and the same thing with actually with the disaster center, for the other guy who was there, he says, this is how you set up a call-in center. People are going to be calling, this is how you can do it. You can set that up. And so because per churches, we didn't have to go through this process. We could just ask for that help, get the resourcing, and then you have all the people in your town, many of whom, like we said, weren't directly affected, but who are like, oh my God, I want to do something. I want to feel like I'm making a difference. Boom, there are all your volunteers in the warehouse. They're taking in all the cards, processing the cards, and looking them over. And so that's the other thing for the church. We play a role, and very often the churches, we can cut red tape. Where government entities, sometimes there's more red tape. We have the possibility, and we have a lot of knowledge of disaster. That's where churches have served, right? Churches have been on the front lines of providing support in disasters. So we are at time.
Have you been called out to support the next community that's been hit?
I haven't been called out. I'm not on the Presbyterian, in the same way. I have gone to many places and been with people informally. What I've done typically, because of my own experience, is I say, hey, I call somebody, not right away. First 48 hours, they're buried. I wait a little while, in different circumstances. I've called people and said, hey, I'm a minister from here. I didn't call you because my experience was I wouldn't have gotten through, or you had told me other things to deal with. I'm here and present and happy to come and be supportive of you, or talk with you either on the phone or whatever works, as you need it. And so I've done that in different settings. And then, like I said, a lot of what we've also done is try to build coalitions with other folks. Newtown, we really try to emphasize this partnership with the urban communities, especially around gun violence, and saying, that we get attention because of what happened in Newtown, but the reality is children are dying every day. Newtown happens, as I say, Newtown happens several times a week in America, where people under the age of 17 die all the time. It's just that nobody's paying attention to that because it's one young person here and there, oftentimes in urban settings, or suicides, in rural settings. But that we can make a difference if we connect, if we have compassion and listen. And so mostly what I also try to do is say, you have my story, and in those circumstances we have an opportunity, like we've gone to DC and met with people. We bring people in from places who never had a chance to come and tell their story, from Oakland to Detroit, other places, come into DC and be able to share their story with lawmakers and others and say, you know, this is my experience. You know, I've lost 3 family members over the course of 7 years. So, you know, I mean, for some people, it's it's not just a one-time experience. It's an experience that's happened several times. So.
Thank you so
Right.
much.
Thank you.
On a lighter note, did anyone ever get to eat a piece of pie?
We did. You know.
Okay.
Well, we had a good time because we would joke. The Episcopal priest would say, "Oh no, you don't want to deliver this here. You want to deliver it to the Roman Catholic Church down there." we would send people over to other people's places.
As a community, they all gained 5 pounds each over